The night the billionaire collapsed, no one from his world stepped forward to catch him. It was a man in worn-out sneakers, holding his young daughter's hand, who broke his fall. And what the billionaire whispered next, barely audible, trembling with something deeper than pain, would shatter the illusion of power, wealth, and everything the elite believed they controlled. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of unexpected moments, take a second right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us what truly matters. The city of Chicago was wrapped in cold wind that night, the kind that cut through coats and found its way into bones. Outside a glittering high-rise hosting one of the most exclusive charity galas in the country, luxury cars lined the street like jewels. Inside, powerful names laughed beneath chandeliers, their voices polished, their smiles rehearsed. Outside, life moved differently, quieter, harsher, more honest. Ethan Cole stood near the curb, adjusting the strap of his faded backpack while his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, leaned against him, clutching a half-finished sandwich wrapped in paper. Ethan wasn't supposed to be here. He had just finished a long shift at a nearby warehouse, and this street happened to be the fastest route home. But Sophie had insisted they stop for a moment to look at the pretty lights, her eyes wide with wonder at a world that felt galaxies away from their own. Ethan was a single father by circumstance, not choice. His wife, Rebecca, had passed away 3 years earlier after a sudden illness, leaving him to raise Sophie alone. Since then, his life had been a quiet storm of exhaustion, love, sacrifice, and quiet resilience. He worked double shifts when he could, skipped meals more often than he admitted, and wore the same worn jacket every winter. But he never let Sophie feel the weight of their struggles. To her, he was everything, her protector, her storyteller, her entire world. That night, as laughter spilled out of the gala doors and a group of elegantly dressed guests stepped outside for fresh air, something shifted in the atmosphere. A tall man in an expensive suit, recognizable to many as Jonathan Hayes, a billionaire tech mogul whose name was often featured in headlines, staggered slightly as he walked down the steps. At first, no one noticed. Or perhaps they chose not to. Conversations continued, champagne glasses clinked, and polite smiles remained fixed. But then Jonathan faltered again, his hand gripping the railing as if the ground beneath him had suddenly become uncertain. His face had lost all color, and for a brief moment, his powerful presence seemed to dissolve into something fragile. Ethan noticed. It wasn't because he recognized Jonathan. It was because he had spent years learning to read signs of distress, in his daughter, in himself, in life. He saw the subtle tremor, the unsteady breath, the silent plea that most ignored. And then it happened. Jonathan collapsed. His body fell forward, and before it could hit the cold concrete, Ethan stepped in instinctively, catching him with both arms. The impact was heavier than expected, and Ethan staggered back slightly, but he held on. Gasps echoed from the crowd. A few people rushed forward, but they stopped short, unsure, hesitant, perhaps afraid of getting involved in something messy, something real. Ethan lowered Jonathan carefully to the ground, his voice calm as he told Sophie to step back. He checked for breathing, for a pulse, things he had learned during a first aid course years ago when Sophie was just a toddler. Jonathan's eyes fluttered open, barely. And then he spoke. Not loudly. Not clearly. But enough. He whispered something that didn't belong in that world of wealth and control. He said he was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. Not the kind that a vacation or luxury could erase. It was deeper. A kind of exhaustion that came from years of carrying something invisible, something heavy and unspoken. Ethan leaned closer, trying to understand, and Jonathan's hand weakly gripped his sleeve. In that moment, the billionaire wasn't powerful. He wasn't admired. He was just a human being, breaking. Paramedics were called, and the scene quickly turned into organized chaos. Flashing lights reflected off polished cars, and the gala guests stepped further back, their expressions a mixture of concern and discomfort. Someone mentioned Jonathan's name in hushed tones, and suddenly the weight of who he was began to settle over the scene. But Ethan didn't care who he was. To him, Jonathan was just a man who needed help. Sophie watched quietly, her small hand clutching her father's sleeve again. She had seen her father step into difficult moments before, always without hesitation, always without expecting anything in return. As the paramedics loaded Jonathan into the ambulance, his eyes found Ethan one last time. There was something there, gratitude, confusion, maybe even recognition of something he had long forgotten. Ethan thought that would be the end of it. He walked Sophie home that night, the cold wind biting at their faces, but her voice was warm as she asked questions about what had happened. Ethan answered gently, explaining that sometimes people need help, no matter who they are. Life moved on. Days turned into weeks, and the moment became just another memory tucked into the quiet corners of their lives. Until everything changed. One afternoon, Ethan received a call from an unknown number. He almost ignored it, assuming it was another bill collector or spam call. But something made him answer. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and carried an unfamiliar tone of respect. It was someone from Jonathan Hayes's office. They asked if Ethan could come in for a meeting. Ethan hesitated. He didn't understand why. But curiosity, and something deeper, made him agree. The office building was unlike anything Ethan had ever stepped into. Glass walls, polished floors, and an atmosphere that felt almost too perfect. He felt out of place in his worn clothes, but he walked in anyway, holding on to the same quiet strength that had carried him through harder days. When he was finally led into a private office, he saw Jonathan sitting by the window. Alive. Stronger. But different. There was a softness in his expression that hadn't been there before. Jonathan stood slowly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward, it was heavy with meaning. Jonathan finally explained what had happened that night. He had been under immense pressure, business deals, expectations, a life that demanded perfection at every turn. But beneath all of it, he had been struggling with something deeper. Loneliness. Regret. A growing realization that everything he had built had come at the cost of something far more important. And when he collapsed, surrounded by people who admired him but didn't truly see him, it was Ethan, a stranger with nothing to gain, who stepped forward. That moment had changed him. Jonathan admitted that the words he whispered that night weren't just about exhaustion. They were about a life that no longer felt meaningful. Ethan listened quietly, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to being in rooms like this, having conversations like this. But he spoke honestly. He told Jonathan about Sophie. About the struggles of being a single father. About the nights he stayed awake worrying about bills, and the mornings he smiled anyway so his daughter wouldn't feel afraid. He spoke about loss, about love, about the small moments that made everything worth it. He didn't try to impress. He didn't try to fix anything. He just told the truth. Jonathan listened the way someone listens when they realize they've been missing something their entire life. Before Ethan left, Jonathan made an offer. Not charity. Not a handout. An opportunity. He wanted Ethan to work with him, not in the corporate sense, but in a new project he was starting. Something focused on helping families like Ethan's. Something real. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He went home, sat with Sophie, and thought about what truly mattered. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't just about surviving. It was about living. Months passed, and the project grew. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. Jonathan changed. Slowly, but deeply. He became less focused on control and more focused on connection. Less driven by success and more guided by purpose. And Ethan, he found a new path. One where his struggles became strength, where his story became something that could help others. Sophie watched it all with quiet joy, her father no longer carrying the same invisible weight. If this story touched your heart in any way, take a moment to like, share, and comment. Your support helps stories like this reach more people who might need a little hope today. And before we reach the end, here's something special. Comment below the word kindness if you believe even the smallest act can change someone's life. Because that night, on a cold Chicago street, a billionaire didn't just collapse into a single father's arms. He found something he didn't even know he had lost. And a single father, who thought he had nothing to offer but survival, became the reason someone else found their way back to life. Sometimes, the most powerful changes don't come from wealth or influence. They come from a moment. A choice. A simple act of being human.